Chapter 17 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Letty Faces the Terror. The night had closed in, dark and humid. The lake house lay dreaming in silence, and as Letty Thorne stood on the threshold of her open door, she could hear nothing but the tumultuous beating of her own heart. Supper was over, and she was free to retire for the night. She had found her uncle in no way altered in his demeanour towards her. That strange, unexpected interview by the lake, which had taken place but a few hours ago, might have been a dream. It had not changed Geoffrey Thorpe's attitude towards his niece in the smallest degree. He had not referred to it even indirectly, and they sat together in grim silence, whilst they ate their supper of bread and cheese, and the tame little mice crept about their feet in search of crumbs. Perhaps it was only a dream, thought the girl, as she let her eyes wander away into the deep, dark corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to linger even on the sunniest day. As she thought of Harry in the snug, brightly lit parlour of the White Hart, an intense longing came over her to see his adoring glance, to hear his blithe voice. To-morrow they would meet again, but at that moment to-morrow seemed very far distant. How cheerful it would be at the White Hart, with the sound of hearty rustic voices drifting in from the bar parlour, where all the affairs of state were debated and settled over the beer mugs. Mrs. Prescott, the landlady, would be bustling in and out of the best parlour talking to Harry, while she served his savoury supper with her own hands. Everyone loved Harry, and was in open sympathy with his difficulties. To-night he would tell Mrs. Prescott their precious secret, and receive her warm approval and congratulations, and she would hurry away to the bar parlour with the glad tidings. There would be many drinkings to health and happiness, and probably farmers' deputations would find their way to Harry's quarters, and there would be hearty handshakings and more congratulations, and doubtless a very convivial evening would follow. Letty turned her thoughts and eyes back to the actual scene before her, to the haggard figure of the old man who sat in his accustomed seat with his back turned to that aggressive portrait on the wall. How unhappy he looked, how uneasy and harassed, and how ill! How his claw-like hand shook as he raised the battered silver tankard to his shrivelled, trembling lips! The prophetic words uttered that afternoon by Mrs. Hall came back to Letty with a rush. Strange words to be uttered by such a woman. What did they really mean? What significance had they? Could one really foretell the death of another? Surely such events were in the hands of God. Were they fated, or did they come by chance? Suddenly Geoffrey Thorpe jerked around his haggard head with that wild, fearsome glance over his shoulder. The action had become habitual to him. What did it mean? And what at first had given rise to it? Letty forced herself to look critically at the portrait of Mark Thorpe, the man who had been lost at sea. For an instant, as the painted eyes met her own, there was something so sinister and menacing in their glance that she shuddered. What a handsome, striking face it was, but what a hateful one! A careless, devil-me-care expression dominated the upper part. The lower, though finely modelled, was marred by cruel, contemptuous, sneering lines. Why did Geoffrey Thorpe permit the portrait to hang there, when so obviously it tortured his mind and gave him no peace or respite by day or night? The huge log fire had burned low, and the heaps of glowing faggots shed a weird light on the portrait, whilst the high-backed chairs and carved dower chests cast strange, uncouth shadows all around. Letty started as a half-burned log fell with a crash upon the hearth, and then came the beat of rain upon the casement and the moan of a rising wind through the trees. The evening wore away. Letty had gone to her own room, and the clock over the empty stables had long since struck 9. She stirred the glowing embers of the fire into a blaze, for her night's work was only about to begin. She calculated that her uncle and Mrs. Greatrex must both have retired to their rooms, and it would now be safe to commence investigations. As she stood with palpitating heart on the threshold of her open door, shading the guttering candle with her hand, the silence was so intense that it weighed like a pall upon her. On noiseless footfall she crept towards the corridor which ran along the wing beyond her room. As she reached it, the black oak boards gave back a hollow echo to her tread, but she hurried softly on until she reached the cord that was stretched across its mouth. She stooped low down and held out the candle, throwing its flickering beams onto the floor. Yes, Warburton was right. She could distinctly trace footsteps on the thick layer of grey dust, large, untidy footprints, such as might have been made by Geoffrey Thorpe's loose, slippered tread. She straightened herself again and listened intently. Not a sound. She peered down the black tunnel in front of her. Its end was swallowed up in impenetrable darkness. What lay beyond? She could not tell what those closed rooms contained, or upon what errand went those slippered feet. All was mystery still, but she had seen enough to convince her that a human being did pass along that corridor, despite the warning that it was unsafe for human feet. Very cautiously she retraced her way, and regaining her room she closed the door and sat down by the fire to think. She had carried out the first half of her allotted task, the easier half, but as Warburton had assured her would be the case, the discovery she had made had robbed the rest of its greatest terrors. Those footprints in the dust were undoubtedly human. Ghosts, if such entities did exist, left no visible trace of their passage. She felt that it would no longer require superhuman courage, on hearing the approach of that stealthy tread, to throw open her door and ascertain beyond a shadow of doubt who walked the night on so secret an errand. Her courage rose considerably, and though her surroundings were so gloomy and so utterly solitary, and her long brooding over the mystery had weakened her nerves, she decided to carry out the advice given her by Harry and Warburton. She undressed and prepared as if for bed, and wrapping herself in a warm dressing-gown, she took up a book and resigned herself to sit up till daybreak if necessary. Certainly nothing is more trying to the nervous system than awaiting a dreaded uncertainty. More especially is this the case if the ordeal has to be endured in the dead of night. In Letty's case the conditions were rendered even more unpleasant than usual by reason of their setting. The dilapidated old house, which the most material person would have described as ghostly, the peculiar mode of life of its occupants, and the profound and desolating atmosphere of mystery they created, all weighed powerfully against sane and rational reasoning. Letty Thorne was eminently practical in ordinary life, but she possessed the vivid imagination of the artistic temperament, and that imagination had been overdeveloped and unbalanced during the last 3 months of her residence in the lake-house. As she sat by her fire, striving to fix her mind on her book, yet with every sense strung to acutest tension, she counted the slow hours up to the 2nd hour of the new day, as they were told off by the stable clock and the church tower in the distance. Again she mended the fire till it blazed and crackled on the hearth, till it flashed on the sombre draperies of the canopied bed, and lit up the high mantelpiece with its intricate carvings, and the raftered ceiling with its ponderous oaken beams. She strove to fix her thoughts on Harry, and as his face rose before her, she longed to lay her head on his breast and whisper to him. If she could but leave this silent, lonely room and run through the darkness to him! The vague dread was stealing over her again, despite all her efforts. A cold chill crept through the room. The dread grew, and her book fell from her knee to the floor with a dull, heavy sound. Her head had begun to feel hot and tired, and her eyes too heavily weighted with sleep to remain open, and she moved to her window and very softly threw it wide. The night was intensely still. Not a breath stirred the moisture-laden bare branches of the trees. The sky was draped in heavy clouds. Not a star shone betwixt their slowly drifting masses. Suddenly there broke out a dismal howl from the house-dog in his kennel in the yard, and Letty drew in her head hastily. The sensation of icy chill that invaded her came not from the dampness of the atmosphere. It was the result of another sound, faint enough as yet, but still clearly audible to her trained ear, the approach of those footsteps she so dreaded. The vague panic was creeping over her again. Oh, to be out of that grim and silent room, to be with Harry, to have done with the lake-house and its eerie secrets for ever. The fire was dying down. It was surely much darker. She stood up stiffly by the window, every nerve on the rack, every muscle taut, her head turned towards the door. Her pulses throbbed wildly, her very blood seemed to run ice, but she stood there quietly waiting, and mentally repeating to herself the words, "Harry shall not find me a coward." There are moments in life when every power of the mind is unnaturally strained, and when thoughts hitherto undreamed of are formed in one short instant. Letty knew what she had to do, but though she was resolute to do it, she still lacked the physical courage. She had a curious sensation that her feet refused to move. The stealthy footsteps neared her door. They passed it, and went onward towards the barred corridor. In another second or two she had lost trace of them. Inertia dropped from her suddenly, and the thought of Warburton, praying that courage might be given to her, sprang like a flaming sword through her mind. The steps would return again. Deliberately she walked to the door and waited, her hand upon the knob, ready to turn it instantly. Now her straining ears caught another faint sound, the cautious closing of a distant door. A little longer, and she could hear the footsteps creeping back again. Suddenly all fear fell from her and was replaced by an irresistible desire to learn the truth, to know the worst. The footsteps were creeping closer. Now she knew they were about to pass. With a mixture of dread and desperation she threw wide the door. She stood face to face with Geoffrey Thorpe. In that first wild moment the two pairs of eyes held each other in a stern conflict of tenacity. Thorpe was the first to break the spell, with a scared glance over his shoulder. The next moment a large key hanging in his finger clanked against the brass candlestick he carried. "What's this?" he exclaimed harshly. "Why aren't you in bed and asleep?" "I was frightened," she faltered tremulously. "Frightened? What frightened you?" he scoffed, throwing the light on her face and scanning it closely. "Footsteps. I couldn't think what they meant at such an hour." "And what business is it of yours to inquire? Whose footsteps would they be but those of the master of this house? Understand, I won't have any spying here, and I detest spies. Surely I'm at liberty to walk about my own house when and where I please." "Oh, but the howling of the dog startled me. I was reading, not sleeping. I'm sorry," she faltered, almost in tears from the violent reaction overtaking her. She saw him shrink back, and his pale face grew whiter. "The dog shan't keep you awake again, and I allow no reading in bed. You'll burn the house down about our ears. Where'd you get so many candles?" "I buy them in the village," she confessed truthfully. "Oh, but I promise not to do it again, uncle." "Good girl. That's the proper spirit," he answered more genially. "And in future trust me to keep guard over the security of the house. I often stroll round just to see all's right. Good night." He nodded briefly and moved away, and she retired into her room and closed the door. She knew that his last words were false. She detected instantly that he had uttered them as an afterthought, and that his nocturnal prowlings had nothing whatever to do with the safety of the house. He had offered no real explanation of his errand at so strange an hour. She had not expected that he would, yet she felt no relief at finding that the ghost had flesh and bones, and that it was a mortal hand which swept so often over the wall behind her bed. She was more convinced now than ever before that some deep mystery was attached to the house, and she acknowledged to herself that she had not yet begun to solve it. End of chapter 17.